France. December 1944. Snow shredded the night sky. Diesel smoke hung low over the valley. A convoy of American fuel trucks crawled along a half-frozen road near Sedan, engines roaring, tires spinning in mud. In the lead truck, Lieutenant Eddie Marshall pressed his boot against the clutch, watching the fuel gauge quiver near empty. The radio was dead. Headlights taped to slits. Behind them, artillery thundered. Ahead, the bridge, their only crossing, sagged half-collapsed under shellfire. He muttered through his scarf, "If we stop here, the whole front stops with us." Steam hissed from the engine vents, ghost-like in the cold. The men behind him waited for orders that wouldn't come. The trucks idled in darkness, each loaded with thousands of gallons of gasoline, enough to feed a division, or burn one. But as Marshall stared into the white void beyond the ruined bridge, a thought burned colder than the wind. How had a simple convoy ended up holding the fate of an army? And what did a farmer 3,000 miles away have to do with it? France, winter 1944. By December, the war had become a contest of engines. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, all of them hungry, all of them bleeding fuel into the snow. The doctrine said, "Speed wins wars." Patton repeated it. Eisenhower endorsed it. Command believed it. But on the ground, among the mud and broken wheels, speed had turned into a ghost, something paid for in gallons and lost in translation. Each Sherman tank consumed 100 gallons for every 100 miles. Each 2.5-ton truck burned 6 miles per gallon, on good days, when the roads were dry and the air warm. Now the roads were rivers of ice, and every hill meant spinning tires, wasted throttle, engines screaming just to keep moving. Men began measuring their days not by miles advanced but by gallons remaining. Fuel was the bloodstream of the Allied push east, and lately that blood was thinning. From Paris to the Rhine, every commander wanted more of it. Every depot ran short. And for every forward tank column that demanded supply, another 100 trucks had to crawl behind them, slow, exposed, burning the very thing they were meant to deliver. Logistics officers drew elegant lines on maps. They called it Red Ball Express, a miracle of movement, they said. But the miracle leaked through cracked hoses and overfilled caps. Each convoy operated by the book, maximum speed between checkpoints, full acceleration after curves, tight spacing to maintain formation. It looked efficient on paper. It sounded decisive over the radio. In practice, it was mechanical suicide. Engines overheated. Tires shredded. Carburetors choked from unsteady throttle. Every driver knew it, but procedure was scripture, and scripture, in war, was not to be rewritten. The manuals never mentioned that snow changes combustion. That cold air thickens fuel. That a racing engine, half-frozen, drinks 3 times more than a steady one. Those were truths learned by men with oil on their hands, not stars on their shoulders. By late December, the shortages reached a point of quiet panic. Reports came in from the front, tanks stalled for lack of fuel, artillery batteries rationing their remaining barrels, reconnaissance units grounded. And still the orders came, move faster. It was the paradox of victory. The Allies had won the beaches, the skies, the ports, but not the math. The math was *ling them. Somewhere in the French countryside, convoys ran in circles between depots, engines idling through the night to keep from freezing. Fuel to protect fuel. Every hour lost meant another division waiting cold in the snow, another battle fought without the tanks that should have been there. Marshall knew it. Every driver knew it. They could feel it in their boots, the tremor of a world that ran on gasoline and was running dry. They said the Germans were desperate for fuel. They said Hitler's tanks were starving. But the truth, whispered under the breath of every mechanic, was that both sides were dying of the same wound. And yet, somewhere far beyond the war, on a quiet farm half buried in Nebraska snow, a man none of them had met was about to alter that arithmetic, not with a bullet, but with an idea. Rural Nebraska, 1938. Before the war, before the convoys and the cold, there was only the rhythm of engines and fields. Frank Eldridge rose before dawn every morning. He liked to hear the wind before the machines woke. The air carried the smell of iron, dust, and wheat stubble frozen under frost. He lived alone with his father on 200 acres of hard land west of Kearney. They weren't rich, but they were efficient. His father plowed straight, never wasted motion. Frank inherited that, not the strength, but the precision. He wasn't built for labor. A tractor accident when he was 17 had twisted his left leg. He walked with a measured limp and a quiet stubbornness. But his mind was exact. He could tell when an engine was straining just by the sound, not guessing, not feeling, but measuring in his head, revolutions, compression, temperature drift. The locals said he had a mechanical ear. He called it listening to breath. Machines, to him, were living things. They inhaled fuel, exhaled work. They had moods, temperaments, fatigue. He kept a logbook for every one: tractors, pumps, generators, with columns for wind direction, soil drag, and gallons burned per acre. While others talked about weather, Frank talked about ratios. He worked methodically. Slow throttle, long furrows, even pacing. The neighbors mocked it at first. His fields looked too calm, too deliberate. But his fuel bills came back lighter. Over time, they stopped laughing. Once, a salesman from John Deere stopped by and watched him plow for an hour. "You drive like you're timing the earth," the man said. Frank only nodded. "You push too hard, the soil fights back." At night he sat by the stove, pencil in hand, mapping fuel use against terrain slope. He treated every day's work like a small experiment. What if he shifted up sooner, or kept revolutions steady through a turn? He found patterns. Fewer gear changes meant less waste. Gentle acceleration preserved torque. Constant rhythm, even under strain, used less than surging power. It wasn't science to him. It was decency. Waste, he believed, was a kind of moral failure. He'd seen it in men and in machines: too much speed, too little thought. The war reached him through static-filled broadcasts and headlines pinned to the feed store wall. Poland. France. Britain standing alone. Then Pearl Harbor. He listened at the kitchen table as Roosevelt's voice filled the room. He wanted to enlist. But the limp disqualified him. The letter from the Army Medical Board said, "Not fit for active duty." He folded it once, placed it in the logbook, and went back to his fields. But he didn't stop listening to the war. Each night, the radio told stories of tanks and planes, of supply lines stretching thin, of fuel shortages across Europe. He heard the word logistics as others heard destiny. He began keeping a new notebook, not about soil or wind, but about motion. He charted throttle rhythm versus consumption. He ran his tractors at steady pulse, hour after hour, measuring how small fluctuations in speed affected total burn. The results fascinated him. A constant pace could save nearly 15% of fuel. He wrote it down in careful pencil lines, margin to margin. He wasn't sure why. It simply felt like truth, a quiet, mathematical truth that belonged to him. When neighbors stopped by, they joked that he'd lost his mind. "Frank, you plannin' to write a Bible for tractors?" one said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe," he replied, "if it saves a little gasoline." War or not, machines still breathed the same way. And Frank Eldridge, crippled farmer from Nebraska, intended to keep them breathing right, even if no one else noticed. Years later, that logbook would cross an ocean and change the course of an army. But for now, it sat on a wooden table under a flickering lamp, filled with numbers that no general would ever read. Nebraska, summer 1944. The cicadas droned over the fields. Heat rose from the soil like smoke. Frank Eldridge sat on the porch, radio balanced on the railing, notebook on his knee. The announcer's voice crackled through static. Allied advance stalled near the Seine, fuel shortages reported across multiple armored divisions. Then silence, followed by the brittle voice of a correspondent. Tanks halted, out of fuel. Frank frowned. He turned the knob until the signal cleared, but the words didn't change. Out of fuel. Out of fuel. He said it aloud, as if testing it. Not out of fuel, he murmured. Out of sense. He looked at the pages in his notebook, long columns of figures drawn in graphite. He had been testing throttle rhythms all summer. The results were simple: steady acceleration saved fuel, violent bursts wasted it. Gentle turns, constant speed, fewer gear shifts, the difference was measurable, 15% on average, sometimes more. If one tractor could save gallons, what about 1,000 trucks? What if armies, with their endless engines, learned to breathe instead of sprint? He wrote a note in the margin. Waste comes from fear, men race what they don't understand. At dusk, he walked out to the barn and ran his hand over the tractor's fender. The metal was warm, still ticking softly from the day's labor. Machines, he thought, were honest. They gave back what you gave them. Push too hard, they protested. Treat them with rhythm, they endured. The next morning, he brought the idea to the feed store in town. The men there were arguing about ration stamps and weather. When Frank explained his theory, they laughed. "Frank, you gonna write Eisenhower about plowin' technique?" one said. Another added, "Army's got bigger problems than your field tricks." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But machines don't care who's driving." They shook their heads. The idea lingered anyway, absurd, maybe, but clean. That night, by lamplight, he began drafting a letter. Not to the Army directly, but to someone who might listen, Captain Clark Reeves, an old college friend who'd studied engineering before the war. Reeves was now somewhere in France, attached to a logistics division. Frank wrote in pencil, careful and slow. He described his tests, the savings, the principle of steady burn. He drew a sketch, lines showing throttle pulses like a heartbeat, smooth and even. He ended simply. Speed doesn't win wars. Endurance does. Teach your drivers to keep one rhythm. Let the convoy breathe. He sealed the envelope, stamped it, and left it by the door. For a week he didn't mail it. It felt foolish, a farmer lecturing the Army on motion. But on the 8th day, after another radio bulletin spoke of stranded tanks near Avranches, he walked into town and handed it to the postmaster. "Army mail," he said. "To France." The postmaster raised an eyebrow. "You got kin over there?" "No," Frank answered. "Just someone who listens." Back home, he marked the day in his logbook, August 3, 1944, then went back to the fields. He didn't expect an answer. He didn't expect anything. But as he plowed through the long rows of dust and sun, he found himself easing the throttle, keeping that perfect, even hum, the same rhythm he had written about. The war, he knew, was too large for one man's math. But sometimes, the smallest numbers carried the greatest weight. And somewhere over the Atlantic, his letter began its slow journey through military postrooms, toward a man who would one day bet an entire convoy, and his career, on the logic of a crippled farmer. Rain turned the road to glass. I could feel the steering wheel buzzing through my gloves, a faint vibration from tread lugs skating on clay. 32 fuel trucks behind me, 2 jeeps, a wrecker. France, December 44, somewhere west of Sedan. Night cut to ribbons by sleet. Headlights hooded to slits. Radio coughing static and then nothing. Doctrine said push. Headquarters wanted speed, column tight, gaps closed. But the gorge ahead had narrowed the road to a ribbon with a soft shoulder that ate axles. We were burning gasoline to deliver gasoline, 6 miles to the gallon on paper, 3 in this weather. You could smell it, raw fuel, hot breath of engines choking on their own impatience. In my breast pocket lay a letter creased along sweat lines, pencil script faded from handling. Frank Eldridge. Nebraska. We'd traded notes once in college about bearings and soil drag. Now his words sat like a metronome against my heart. Keep a steady pace. No racing. Let the convoy breathe. Behind me, the sergeant in the second truck flashed his blackout lamp, "Hurry up." I watched the bridge ahead, a Bailey span hammered into place 2 days earlier, shiver under artillery thump somewhere upriver. To our left, the river slid black and swollen. To our right, a ditch that had swallowed 2 civilian lorries by the look of their ribs. Orders on my clipboard read, maintain maximum practicable speed between checkpoints. Closed interval. No halts. The signature block was clean, the ink decisive. But out here the road answered to water and weight, not signatures. Every throttle jab lit the carb rich, every brake feather wasted momentum we could never buy back. I eased the clutch and felt the engine settle to an even hum, 1,700 revolutions per minute, not a heartbeat more. The truck stopped skittering. 30 yards opened behind me like a held breath. The sergeant flashed again. I didn't answer. I thought of Frank's tractors, of furrows cut in one calm pull. I thought of tanks up there in the dark, waiting for what we carried. Sleet thickened. A hairpin approached, a wet turn that had spun a scout car into the ditch an hour earlier. I could picture the manual diagram in my head: downshift, brake before apex, accelerate out. In rain, men do the opposite. They brake in the turn, the tail breaks loose, someone stamps the pedal, and the whole train bunches, each driver wasting fuel to catch up, each engine surging, drowning. "Captain," my driver said, Kowalski, hands raw, eyelids salted with road grit. "Orders say close up for the bridge." "Not tonight," I said. "Hold 30. No brakes in the curve. Let her roll." He looked at me like I had asked him to jump the river. Then he nodded and settled his boot. The needle held steady. We entered the turn as a whisper, not a shout. No skid. No hiss of locked drums. I counted to 5 and felt the weight of the tankers behind us choose patience. The radio stuttered, caught a shard of headquarters, repeat, expedite, and died. Wind shouldered the truck. The windshield wipers beat their tired metronome. At the apex I saw the hazard that would have led us at racing speed, a slab of shell-broken masonry half buried in mud, slick as eel skin. At 30, we rolled over it with a thump and a prayer. At 45, a front axle would have snapped, fuel would have geysered into the dark, and the column would have stacked itself along the guardrail like tin toys. Frank's letter pressed against my ribs. We cleared the curve. The trucks behind ghosted through, each one at the same hum, each one spending exactly what the road would return. No horns, no surge, no panic. I lifted the mic and spoke into the dead air anyway, a habit. "Convoy able, hold 30. 30 yards. No braking in turns. Throttle steady. Let the engines breathe." No one heard it, and everyone did. You could feel the compliance in the way the night quieted, in how the sleet sounded louder than our gearboxes. At the bridgehead a military policeman waved us faster, faster. His eyes said hurry, his boots stood in a skim of diesel that had leaked from a punctured drum. I held our pace. We crossed single file, wood planks rattling, cables humming like a tuning fork. On the far bank the road rose, a long, wet grade that eats gasoline like candy if you fight it. "Fourth gear," I said. "Hold it." Kowalski swallowed. "She'll bog." "Let her." We climbed. Engines behind us found the same note. No one stabbed the throttle. No one spun. The grade gave back what we asked, not a drop more. Halfway up, artillery walked somewhere close enough to taste iron. I waited for fear to push my foot. It didn't. I stayed with the metronome in my pocket. That's how it began, not with speed, but with refusal. Not with a new order, but with a different rhythm. And in that rain, on that brittle road, a farmer's pencil marks crossed the ocean and took the wheel. Dawn hadn't come, only a paler shade of dark. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon dipped in oil, bordered by trees stripped to bone. The bridge was behind us now, intact, by miracle, but the column still crawled through rain thick enough to erase the world. Orders were simple: rush the fuel to the front. They said the offensive depended on it. Yet the word rush had become a curse. Every convoy that tried to obey came back half empty, half broken, or not at all. I pulled the truck over just long enough for the others to see my signal light blink twice. Halt. 32 engines sighed into silence. Steam drifted upward like surrender. Sergeant Harlan climbed down from the second vehicle, mud up to his knees. "Sir," headquarters said, "full speed to Sedan." If we don't make it," I cut in, "they'll get nothing." He frowned. "So what's the play?" I took Frank's letter from my pocket, the paper soft from handling, rain bleeding the graphite lines. I read the words again by flashlight: keep distance. Constant throttle. Engines are lungs, let them breathe. I folded it carefully. "New plan," I said. 30-yard spacing. Steady speed. No overtaking, no braking unless you must. Convoy moves as one body, not 32 fighting each other. The sergeant stared at me. "Sir, that's not regulation driving. You'll have our hides if command checks the logs. Logs don't matter if we don't arrive." He looked back toward the line of trucks. The men waited, faces lit by the dim red of dashboard lamps. Rain whispered on the canvas tops. The world seemed to hold its breath. "All right," he muttered. "Your funeral." "Not mine," I said. "Theirs, if we do it the old way." We climbed back in. I pressed the clutch, eased the gear, and rolled forward until the speedometer needle hovered at 28. The driver matched my rhythm without words. Behind us, engines woke one by one, synchronized like instruments tuning to the same low note. Through the mirror, the convoy formed a chain of moving shadows. Each headlight slit blinked through the rain, equidistant, unwavering. There was no roar now, only the deep, even thrum of 32 engines breathing together. At first it felt wrong, almost timid. Every instinct begged to hurry. But then something changed. The truck stopped slipping. Tires bit clean into mud. The curve of the road carried us instead of fighting us. Fuel gauges, once trembling, steadied. The radio spat faint static, then the voice of another officer somewhere upriver. "Convoy Baker lost 2 tankers on the grade, skidded off the embankment. They're blocking the road. Any units behind, reroute." I glanced at Harlan. He didn't speak. He just tightened his grip on the window frame and watched the mist swallowing everything behind us. "Keep formation," I said into the intercom. "We hold 30. No more." He nodded slowly. "You think your farmer's trick is worth a court-martial?" "I think it's worth fuel in their tanks." Miles passed. The rain eased to drizzle. Mud turned to packed clay under our tires, and the rhythm we'd built carried itself, a heartbeat stretched across machines. No one shouted. No one overtook. The convoy glided through ruined villages and shattered hedgerows like a river under command of a single thought. When artillery thundered far off, no truck stalled. When shell shock tremors hit, no man panicked. At 0430 we reached the ridge above the valley. The first light seeped through the cloud cover, gray, reluctant. Down below, the depot lights blinked faintly through fog. "Contact ahead," Harlan whispered. "That's our drop." I let out a long breath. The engines behind us were still purring, clean and steady. No stalls. No fires. Not one truck lost. He stared at me for a long time, then said quietly, "Guess the parade works." I smiled, though it felt more like exhaustion than triumph. "Not a parade," I said. "A pulse." Behind us, 31 trucks kept that pulse alive, the quiet rebellion of rhythm over order, sense over doctrine. And as we descended toward the depot, I realized this wasn't disobedience. It was the correction of a lie, that speed was victory. In truth, endurance was. By the time the sun broke through the rain, we were still moving, every engine breathing the same slow breath. By the time the sun found us, the rain had hardened to frost. The road shimmered under a thin crust of ice, reflecting the convoy's ghost-like shapes. We crested the final ridge at dawn, 32 trucks, one breath. Below us, the valley opened into a patchwork of ruined barns and fuel drums. Smoke from the forward depot hung low, drifting east with the wind. The smell of gasoline hit first, then wood smoke, then something faintly sweet, diesel spilled on frozen soil. "Convoy able to depot 2, I called into the radio. The words vanished into static, then returned, faint but alive. "Depot 2. Copy, able." "You made it?" I looked at the gauges. Every needle steady. All trucks accounted for. There was a pause. Then disbelief, "Repeat that, able." "All?" "Affirmative." When we rolled into the yard, mechanics came running, faces pale, eyes squinting against the low glare of morning. They counted trucks like survivors off a shipwreck. Not one missing, not one out of fuel. The depot chief, a captain with oil stains on his sleeves, stopped me as I climbed down. "We expected half. Where in God's name did you find the fuel?" "We didn't," I said. "We stopped losing it." He frowned, thinking it was sarcasm. Then he saw the numbers. Fuel logs were measured to the gallon, departure, arrival, remainder. Our convoy's consumption came in 15% lower than any recorded run from Reims to Sedan. The clerk double-checked. Then a third time. The math refused to lie. Engines that should have coughed their last mile still idled steady. Tires that should have shredded were intact. We hadn't just arrived, we had rewritten what arrival meant. While crews began unloading, the men gathered near the trucks, faces gray from exhaustion. No cheering. Just that hollow quiet that follows disbelief. One driver muttered, "First time I ever seen the gauge climb after a hill." Harlan grinned, teeth white against mud. "Guess your farmer knew his stuff." I didn't answer. I walked to the edge of the yard and watched the valley. The sky had turned pale gold. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Sherman tanks waited for what we carried, each of them drinking 100 gallons per 100 miles, each one now a little closer to moving again. Within an hour, the depot's loading platforms came alive. Hoses hissed, drums clanged, men shouted coordinates. A tanker sergeant waved his clipboard, "These go to Patton's 3rd, urgent priority." By noon, the first fuel lines snaked out of the yard toward the front. I watched them go, our cargo reborn as momentum. The depot commander joined me. "How'd you pull that off, Captain? You run downhill the whole way?" "No," I said. "We ran together." He laughed, short and uncertain, then shook my hand. "Whatever you did, do it again." I didn't tell him it wasn't mine. I didn't mention the letter folded in my coat pocket, now soft as cloth from rain. I only thought of Nebraska, of steady plows cutting even furrows, of an old friend with a limp who had listened to the earth until it spoke in mathematics. The men refueled and slept where they parked. Some leaned against their hoods, others slumped in the mud. The engines cooled, ticking softly, the sound of rest. By evening, word had already spread. An officer from logistics arrived to inspect the logs. He stared at the figures, at the perfect spacing noted in each driver's account, at the absence of breakdowns. He left without comment. But later that night, I heard him on the field phone saying, "Maybe we've been driving wrong." The next morning, the tanks at the front rolled again. When their tracks carved fresh lines through snow, the radio chatter changed. The phrase wasn't "speed wins wars" anymore. It was something quieter, borne on the breath of exhausted drivers as they pushed through the frost. "Keep the convoys breathing." I sat by the truck, coffee gone cold, and unfolded Frank's letter once more. The pencil lines had blurred, but the last sentence remained clear. "Machines breathe. If you rush them, they choke." I folded it back into my coat. The front had moved on, but somewhere between the mud and the frost, a rule had cracked, and through that crack, a little logic had leaked into the machinery of war. The report reached headquarters 2 days later. Typed in carbon copy, smudged with grease, convoy able, 32 vehicles delivered full load, 0 losses, fuel efficiency 15% above standard. At first, no one believed it. A clerk assumed a decimal error. A colonel at G for logistics scrawled in the margin, "Verify through depot." When the figures held, disbelief turned to irritation. Success without authorization was more dangerous than failure with permission. I was summoned to the divisional command post, a gutted farmhouse outside Verdun that smelled of wet wool and lamp oil. Maps plastered every wall, red grease pencil arrows stabbing east. The colonel behind the table didn't look up from his papers when he spoke. "Captain Reeves," he said, "your convoy ignored standing speed protocol." "Yes, sir." "You also delayed delivery by 4 hours." "Yes, sir." He finally looked at me. "And yet the depot claims you consumed less fuel than any convoy on record." "That's correct." "How?" I told him the truth, the spacing, the constant throttle, the refusal to rush. His jaw tightened. "You mean you slowed down?" "We stopped wasting motion," I said. He tapped a pencil against the map. "Do you realize what would happen if every officer started rewriting procedures?" I did. I also knew what would happen if none of us did. He dismissed me with the standard phrase, "Pending review." Outside, the snow had thickened again, swirling across the motor pool. I half expected an arrest order by morning. But instead, silence. 3 nights later, a courier brought a message from the quartermaster's office, an informal request for additional notes on convoy pacing methodology. No signature. No seal. Just curiosity disguised as bureaucracy. Then whispers began. Mechanics comparing logs. Drivers talking over coffee. Someone had done a run through the Ardennes using the steady method and reported the same miracle: cooler engines, fewer breakdowns, lower burn. Soon the phrase took root in radio slang. Convoy leaders called it rolling quiet. Others said Eldridge pacing, though most had no idea who Eldridge was. By January, the Third Army's Transport Command quietly circulated a memo: maintain consistent speed and extended spacing under adverse road conditions. Field observation shows improved mechanical endurance. It read like common sense, but those sentences had been born in defiance. I wasn't commended. Instead, I was transferred, temporary reassignment to instructional duty. It sounded like exile, and maybe it was. My job: brief other convoy officers on experimental efficiency protocols. No medals, no citations, just the polite invisibility reserved for useful mistakes. But the results spoke louder than any order. Fuel wastage along our sector dropped by 10% in a week. Units that adopted the method reached their destinations with extra reserves, enough to keep tanks moving during the final push into Germany. Still, the brass refused to call it doctrine. They said it was situational adaptation. The kind of phrase that let them claim authorship without admitting fault. The men didn't care. They knew what worked. Over the radio you could hear it: voices steady, engines steady. The war had found a new tempo. One evening, while logging mileage outside Trier, I received a telegram printed in all caps, words spaced like breaths between them. Your idea work stop, you kept US moving stop. No name. No signature. Just confirmation that somewhere, someone higher than me had noticed. I folded the slip and placed it beside Frank's letter. 2 pieces of paper, one written in pencil, one in ink. Between them lay the entire argument of the war: order versus reason. Weeks later, when Germany finally cracked and the G*NS began to fall silent, our last convoy rolled east through fields littered with the skeletons of burned-out trucks. Most had died not from shellfire but from waste, overheating, overloading, overcommanding. We drove past them slowly, in rhythm, the way Frank had taught me. The air smelled of thawing fuel and the beginning of something that might be peace. No medals waited at the depot. No speeches. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a farmer's logic had outlived the war's fury. When the G*NS finally quieted, the world exhaled like an exhausted engine. Spring came, slow and unsure, washing the snow from the ruined roads. The convoys thinned, the orders softened. Men went home by rail, by ship, by silence. And in the middle of it all, Frank Eldridge's name appeared once, in a letter filed among 1,000 others. It came from the office of the Quartermaster General, dated May 1945. To Mr. Frank J. Eldridge, Kearney, Nebraska. The United States Army extends its gratitude for your contribution to fuel efficiency recommendations tested in European operations. Your observations proved of measurable value to convoy logistics. That was all. No medal, no citation. Just a line of type and a patch: Quartermaster Corps, wheel and sword crossed beneath a torch. Frank pinned it to the wall beside his old farm maps and said nothing. The neighbors didn't understand. They'd heard rumors that some local farmer had written a letter that saved tanks in France. It sounded like one of those post-war exaggerations, the kind told over beer when the papers ran out of heroes. But Frank wasn't the type to explain. He returned to his land the way a mechanic returns to his bench, quiet, methodical, ready to mend what had been left running too long. The tractors were older now, the soil harder, but the rhythm remained. Slow starts. Even throttle. No waste. He logged his work in a new notebook, same neat handwriting, same tiny columns of numbers. The war had changed the world, his fields did not care. Sometimes, on still mornings, the postman would bring him envelopes stamped with Army return addresses. Inside were questions, small, bureaucratic, curious. Could you clarify how you calculated burn rate under constant throttle? Did you test your pacing method on variable inclines? He answered every one, pencil on plain paper, the way he always had. By 1950, the convoy efficiency method had found its way into the training manuals at Fort Lee, Virginia. The language was technical, stripped of origin, but the soul was intact. Maintain uniform speed. Avoid acceleration surges. Observe mechanical breathing cycles under load. No one mentioned Nebraska. They didn't need to. The method spoke for itself. During the fuel crisis of the 1970s, trucking companies across America rediscovered the same principles. Engineers called it convoy pacing or dynamic throttle management. Drivers just called it the old way. They kept their rigs 30 yards apart, matching speed like a single pulse on the interstate. It saved fuel. It saved engines. Sometimes, it saved lives. Frank lived long enough to see the headlines, "Energy Emergency, Nation Urged to Conserve." He smiled at that. The world, he thought, was finally learning to listen. When a local paper interviewed him in 1974, the reporter asked what it felt like to have influenced Army doctrine. Frank shook his head. "I didn't teach soldiers," he said. "I just taught engines not to panic." He died the next spring, quietly, in his sleep, a notebook on the nightstand. Inside were his last notes, measurements of wind drag on new tractor models, equations half finished. On the final page, he'd written a single sentence. "Everything that moves must learn its rhythm." Years later, historians at the Quartermaster Museum found his correspondence filed under Civilian Recommendations, 1944. Most had yellowed to near illegibility. But in one corner of an Army training manual from 1952, someone had typed a small addendum, uncredited and unremarkable. Eldridge pattern, recommended formation pacing for extended convoy operations. No one could say who added it. It might have been a clerk, a typist, a captain remembering a story told in a mess tent. But the words endured, buried in bureaucracy, preserved by practicality. And though the man himself faded back into the soil that raised him, his idea kept rolling, quiet, efficient, inevitable, as if the entire world had learned, at last, how to breathe. He never fired a G*N. He never crossed the ocean. He just changed how trucks moved. Frank Eldridge died without medals or mention, but his rhythm outlived him, quiet as breath between gears. Every convoy that rolled steady through rain, every engine that lasted one more mile, carried his logic. He'd broken a rule not out of rebellion, but because he understood the truth beneath every machine, that motion without thought is waste, and waste is death. Some wars are won by those who pull the trigger. Others, by the ones who know when not to. Somewhere on an empty road, a driver still keeps 30 yards of silence ahead of him. And the world, for a moment, breathes right.